I found this very interesting article on Urban Scoop, in which Tommy Robinson claims Adolf Hitler was a socialist because he borrowed a few ideas from Karl Marx, notably. Well, I think the best way to understand National Socialism or proto-Nazism, for want of a better description, is actually to read The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg. It's detailed there very clearly the whole purpose of National Socialism and the projected endgame of it. So what was National Socialism? Well, actually, it wasn't socialism at all, was it? The socialist aspect was a SOP, in actual fact. I guess you could say a strategic ruse to counteract the virulent Marxists in Bavaria. You must remember that they had actually created the Soviet Socialist Republic of Bavaria prior to Adolf Hitler rising to prominence in the region. And obviously they had a very serious problem with the Reds, as they called them, Marxists, communists, Bolsheviks, you name it. Call them what you will, it's pretty much one and the same thing. And socialism doesn't always lead to communism, because the Soviet Union was the union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, no less. Communism, socialism, socialism, communism. Is there really a difference? Well, socialism, as we know it today, I guess you could say, in the Labour Party, under Starmer, himself a former Trotskyist stroke Pabloist, yet again, not much of a difference in actual fact. Well, pretty much all of them have been communist sympathisers at some point or another, but they've never been Nazi sympathisers. And for Tommy Robinson to actually claim that Hitler wasn't really anti-communist at all is just absolutely ludicrous in actual fact. Okay, so they made a temporary pact with the Soviet Union. So in actual fact that both sides could build up their resources for the great clash that was to follow. That was the only purpose of it, basically. There was no ideological sameness, slight similarities in the fact that both were authoritarian regimes, but we live in a totalitarian regime today, according to Tommy Robinson. And I wholeheartedly agree with him. We do indeed. We have a legislative tyranny which props up an elective dictatorship. However, that said, did Hitler attempt to mimic the ideas and ideology of Karl Marx? I don't think so at all, in actual fact. The principal purpose of National Socialism, which was in actual fact ultra-nationalism, combined with racial supremacy, the belief in the superiority of the Aryan man and woman over all other races on earth, mixed with Germanic and Nordic mysticism. And of course, a dedication to scientific excellence, which we saw with the SS at Peenemünde. Obviously, and that most of that technology was taken under Operation Paperclip, and obviously Britain had its share of it, as did the Russians, and the French also got some, because the Nazis were in actual fact well ahead of the curve, and the Allies, who outnumbered them 8-1, were considerably behind the curve. But was Hitler a socialist himself? Well, if we look at the Volkswagen, for example, I guess you could say that was a classic example of socialist economics, without a shred of a doubt, in actual fact. But it was done under a completely different economic system, which had divorced usury, interest-bearing debt, in actual fact, one of the primary reasons for World War II. The fact that Hitler effectively sacked the Rothschilds' banking system, thus guaranteeing war would come. And he did it obviously for a reason, because he wanted to eradicate Germany of Jewish and foreign influences. So Tommy, of course, is right about that. But, to actually say that Hitler and the Nazis copied the Marxist economic system simply is not true at all. In fact, it's wonky. It's way off mark. Truly it is. Halimar Schatz, in actual fact, a centre-right politician who petitioned Hindenburg with the industrialists to make Hitler the Chancellor, and obviously succeed in doing so. And of course, the rest we know is history, isn't it? Well, obviously, they introduced this interest-free economic system in which loans were granted to those who needed them. In other words, to fuel the economic miracle, which is what the Nazis called it, the economic miracle. And it was interest-free. So if you borrowed 20,000 Reichsmark, that's exactly what you paid back. Not 29% interest or 33% interest, or as we see today, sometimes 300% interest. Absolutely outlandish in actual fact, but that's the hallmark of capitalism. Usury. In other words, debt slavery. Banker occupation, as many people would call it, and that's what Hitler brought to an end. Banker occupation. And of course the bankers didn't want that, did they? But that said, Halimar Schatz himself was, I guess you could say, a banker, and together they came up with a new economic system which in actual fact had absolutely no relationship whatsoever to Karl Marx and redistribution of the wealth. The Nazis were never dedicated to the redistribution of wealth, not in the slightest. No, the industrialists, and those corporations still exist to this day, made vast sums of money from rearmament and also from the death camps, from the concentration camps, so-called. Particularly from medical experiments, and obviously that data was used basically to create new medicines, which are still in use to this day in actual fact. And the Allies, of course, didn't turn their nose up at this data, this fundamental research, however it was obtained by unsavory methods, obviously, in many cases. No, they incorporated it into their own medical systems, and that included the Soviets. And to say that Hitler was not really anti-communist, and perhaps Tommy's trying to say that the centre-right are the real anti-communists, is laughable. It was Adolf Hitler who absolutely insisted on Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, to not only to seize that landmass, but primarily to eradicate Judeo-Bolshevism. And of course the notorious Commissar order was Hitler's idea as well. Not quite pro-socialist or pro-communist, was it? And the order also extended to the Wehrmacht, not just the SS. And obviously the Einsatzgruppen were primarily tasked with it as well. So that consisted of, if any political commissar was captured in action, they were to be interrogated for a brief time and then unceremoniously shot, or in many cases, in actual fact, just shot on the spot, because they were classed as the disease carriers of communism. Not quite in keeping with what Mr. Robinson's trying to say about Hitler being a socialist. Was Hitler a socialist? No, ultimately he was an ultranationalist. First and foremost, he was an ultranationalist, German ultranationalist. And yes, he embraced Nordic mysticism, Germanic mythology, whatever you want to call it, cosmology, in actual fact, is what I call it. He embraced all of that. And of course, that played a fundamental and pivotal role in National Socialism, in that the Nazis believed the way to reconnect the German people with their heritage was through Germanic cosmology and Nordic mysticism. We see this obviously with the SS units in particular, the use of runes and runic iconography, and just about everything that they wore. Of course, the two SS flashes, the Sigrun or Sigrun, yeah. So the similarities with communism are actually quite limited, to be perfectly honest. And Tommy, I think, has gone way off course, really, here, particularly when he likens Mark Collett, who is a Hitler simp, and his sidekick, Laura Towler, an Oswald Mosley simp, in the context of National Socialism. Well, Collett, quite frankly, is a vastly overrated egomaniac, bloated with his own self-importance, and Laura Towler is just his faithful simp, quite frankly, married to a very brave man who is sadly connected to both of them. I'm talking about Sam Melia, of course. Not sure they'll see that the same way, and that's entirely up to them. I couldn't care less what they think. The issue is we're talking here about political science, about ideology. Did the Nazis borrow some ideas from the communists? Most definitely, yes. There's no doubt about that. Joseph Goebbels said he was very impressed by the propaganda work of Lenin. And therefore, in Berlin, which was a red city until Goebbels took over and turned it into a National Socialist city, by a whisker, admittedly, but it was a remarkable task which he succeeded in doing, and he did so by using exactly the same propaganda tactics. So afterwards the Nazis had their own propaganda ministry. Well, all nations have a propaganda ministry, don't they? It's called the mainstream media. It serves as exactly the same thing, and for the same purpose, to push the single narrative, or the narrative that the ruling junta wants us to believe. And that's one of the reasons why we have the Online Safety Act to this day, the whole purpose of which was to usher in the age of the single narrative, and everything else would be dismissed as false and misleading information. In fact, Tommy has made quite a meal of that, hasn't he, recently, with the people sent to prison for reposting false and misleading information. I've also made several vlogs about it myself. But back to the issue of Marxism and Nazism. Well, they're fundamental, deadly enemies, in actual fact. Whilst there are similarities, for certain, these two ideological forces were utterly committed to the destruction of each other. What happened in World War II, quite simply, is that the Soviet Union, backed up by the Allies, were able to overwhelm the Nazis by sheer weight of numbers, as opposed to military skill. So really, had the Nazis fought the Soviets alone without having 2 million soldiers elsewhere governing occupied territories, it may well have been a very different outcome. We must remember in 1943, Stalin actually offered Hitler all of the land he'd got, including Ukraine, if they withdrew from the rest. And Hitler turned it down, obviously, and as we know, the rest is history. Apparently he committed suicide in the bunker. Or maybe he went to Argentina on a submarine, according to some people. Who knows? That's something we'll get to later. But when we're talking about the horseshoe theory, well, that also is wonky thinking. But where the horseshoe theory does work, in actual fact, very well, and I know Tom and his fanboys won't like this at all, in the slightest, and that's fine, that's no problem, is the fact that the centre-right, in the modern context, and the centre-left are almost indistinguishable from one another in the context of the diversity delusion, which they're always ranting about, in actual fact. In fact, the only real differences between them and the horseshoe theory is Palestine, Israel, and of course Tommy is opposed to the Islamists, which of course the left are very soft on, as we know. And so the differences between the centre-right and the centre-left basically are so minimal, at times it's almost impossible to tell the difference between them, because is there really a difference? In fact, we'll see what Liam Tuffs has to say in a second with his recent interview with Tommy before he went to prison, in which it was established Tommy Robinson is not right-wing at all.
Recently, very, very smart guy, very politically savvy, and he's interviewed you on his podcast, The Strongest Argument, and he said to me that Tommy's not even right-wing, let alone far-right. So